Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. Yes, I would like to talk with you in the coming hour about happiness in South Africa. Let me see. Oh, that's the... Yeah, okay, great. So, Talida already told you about like my background. Like I'm part of three universities. I'm a visiting professor here at the University of Johannesburg, and then next to it, I'm a professor at the Open University of the Netherlands, and I run the Erasmus Happiness Economics Research Organization, where I spend most of my time. And this organization, like, is wonderful. It's an organization that does academic research, but also does like a lot of practical research. And what we would like to do with via research and education is contribute to a greater happiness for a greater number of people. And that is also like why I like ISQOLS so much, because I feel that like a lot of the people here do the research not only for the sake of doing research, but also because they try to make the world a better place through research. So research becomes in the end a tool and is not a means to an end. And like we do that ourselves predominantly through enabling people, but we also do research in organizations and for governments to make more informed choices for a better life. Well, what that better life is, we will discuss soon. Outline of my presentation. I will first discuss briefly, it's time for Africa, the question. Some of you asked me, did I refer to the Shakira song when I came up with that title? No, not necessarily, but for those who asked, the picture is in here, and for the rest you won't see pictures of Shakira anymore. And I will also briefly explain why it's time for Africa and why it's so important to like have more research on well-being and happiness in Africa. I think then we will go on discussing like what we know about happiness in Africa, and especially what we think we know about happiness in Africa, because I think what we think we know, especially I think most Western research is based on the World Happiness Report. So I will start with discussing those figures and then go on and discuss with you whether this is like a fair representation of like well-being and happiness in Africa, and is this also focusing on using the right conceptualization of well-being, and if you do slightly different measurements and conceptualization of well-being, how would like the picture look then? So like a very full program for an hour, so I hope I'll make it till the end. Before we'll start, like what we think we know, of course, I first like to acknowledge that there has already been a lot of research in Africa, and there have been fabulous researchers working on this. Talida, Stephanie Rossau, also Valerie Muller, Habib Tilouin, Ian Rothman, all some of here mentioned here who've done like a tremendous amount of work on Africa. So it's not that there like is not beyond the World Happiness Report a lot available. But like why is it time for Africa is because like a lot of the happiness research is still what we would call weird. So what we term weird means Western. It's about educated populations, it's about industrial populations, it's about rich populations, and it's about developed populations in developed countries. You will see that most of the research that appears in top journals is still focused on these populations, while at the same time only 12% of the world population would qualify as like weird. But that also means that we might generalize also based like on this like weird population, and which we'll assume that these behavioral science findings in psychology, happiness economics, well-being economics, how you like to call it, are universal, but we can question whether these findings are universal. And especially Africa, with like a 17% global population share, is underrepresented in this research. Like I heard from Martijn Hendricks, one of the editors of Journal of Happiness Studies, that, please correct me if I'm wrong at the cocktail, but that 12% of the submissions only comes from Africa. And like the share of papers that comes from outside Western nations is increasing, but it's mostly coming from Asian countries. Well, in good news in psychology, we have like a little bit more articles focusing on Africa, 3% nowadays, so like a neighboring field, but at the same time you can see that there is time for Africa, and it's time to do more research on this wonderful continent. So let's first see what we know from the World Happiness Report on happiness. And I think that most of you who study well-being are familiar with the World Happiness Report. And before diving into the numbers, it's first like important maybe to stand still, like what we mean with like well-being, quality of life. I always use like Ruud Veenhoven's scheme for that. So if you think about quality of life, you can think about quality of life that is like external, so like within the living environment of people, external to the person or internal, and you can talk about the conditions of the good life and the outcomes of a good life. And in happiness studies, we mostly look at the quadrant in the right corner, so where we look at the outcomes of a good life internal to a person, which appears under very different numbers in the psychology and economics literature, but we often talk about appreciation of life and happiness. And what usually happens in our field of study, we usually gauge with what type of conditions are important for people's appreciation of life. But then still, as a human being, we have different ways on how to judge or whether to judge whether we are happy or not, whether our life is good or not. And on the one hand, we have a more cognitive judgment that is about how our current life compares to the most ideal life we have in mind. And we have at the same time like a more emotional judgment at our disposal. So whether we experience predominantly positive emotions during a longer period of time. Well, if we look at the overall happiness, then it's made up of these two types of measurements. The one we call the hedonic level of affect, the balance of pleasant and unpleasant affect, and the other is referred to as contentment, so perceived realization of one's or how far our life is from the most ideal life that we have in mind. And so these two judgments come from different information bases. So the hedonic level effect is based on affective experience, and it is the idea that we predominantly feel pleasant like feelings when our basic needs are met. While contentment is much more based on the cognitive comparison, where social comparisons and also adaptation plays a role, and also very much dependent on reference points that people set of like what is a good life. Well, if you look at the World Happiness Report, it's gradually changing, but it has predominantly focused on the contentment measure. And the contentment measure is within the happiness report operationalized using the Cantrell ladder. And the Cantrell ladder is a method that dates back to the 1960s, where it is asked, like, please imagine a ladder with steps numbered 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top is the best possible life you can imagine. The bottom is the worst possible life you can imagine. On which step of the ladder would you say you personally stand at this time? So people fill out like between 0 and 10, meaning worst possible life to the best possible life. Well, the Gallup World Poll has held this survey now for over, I would say, since 2006, almost 20 years. So there's already like a very nice time series available. If you would look at distributions, you see that varies from country to country. This is like a typical distribution or the average distribution that you will find in South Africa, where you see that the biggest group is the group that gives their life a 5, followed by a 4 and a 6. The average in South Africa over all these years on the Cantrell ladder has also been around the 5. We also see a lot of inequality in South Africa. So given that they're still about 15% of the people that gives their life an 8 or higher. But you also see a lot of people that are extremely dissatisfied with their life, giving their life an 4 or lower. If you will compare that to the Netherlands, like you see a very different picture, so where like the Cantrell ladder is more around a 7.5 on average, and where you see that most people give their life a 7 or an 8, and that usually leads, if you do that in all countries, to the following world map, where you see the contentment in the world. Division, where the happiest countries can be found in the Nordic. So like Finland is already for a couple of years number 1, followed by countries like Norway, Sweden, Iceland, the Netherlands, Switzerland. And you also see that in Africa, the Cantrell ladder score is much lower. So you see the top African country is Mauritius on the 59th place. Their level on the Cantrell ladder is about like a 6. And then Somalia, South Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon. But they're all ranked like above place 100 out of like 140 to 160 countries depending on the year. That seems like this is like the picture that is like given like in the yearly rankings, like which gives a kind also of depiction that Africa must be like a miserable place to live. I'll come back later to that statement, but you see that if you try to explain why the level of contentment is higher in one part of the world than another part of the world, then there are some obvious factors that are correlated with this contentment. So things like GDP per capita, institutional quality, health expenditures, also average number of years of education in a country, degree of the openness of an economy, so a globalization measure, trade openness, but also the degree of urbanization, while the level of unemployment is negatively related. And so you see a couple of education, health and economic factors explaining the pattern that you saw on the previous graph here. So we can actually if you look at the level of contentment, very well explain the variation in well-being scores across the world. This set of variables that you show would like already explain like 70 to 75% in variation. It's also that like if you look at contentment over time, it doesn't seem that Africa has like moved along a lot. So there haven't been a lot of studies on developing countries before like the 2000s. There's only very limited evidence available. Most developing country studies that have been done using the Cantrell ladder, or either by Mr. Cantrell himself and by George Gallup in the 1970s. But you see, while Nigeria scored a 4.8 in the 1960s, that was like in the 2000s and 2020s a 5.1. There's not been like a lot of research on other specific African countries before the 2000s. You see like some data on South Africa though, but not on Cantrell ladder scores. But also you haven't seen much progress there in Cantrell ladder scores over time. Doesn't mean that progress is not possible, but it varies like from country to country. If you look like at countries like Brazil or Panama or even the Philippines and Poland, you see that Cantrell ladder scores have like progressed over time. So then also the question is like, why is Africa not catching up? And it's not like that Africa has not really improved in many respects. In many respects, objective quality of life has improved in Africa. If you look, for example, at child mortality in 1980s, you see that like in some places it was over 30%, or actually in a lot of places, and that has been tremendously reduced by 2015. Also, if we look at the average years of education, we saw at least in cross-section like a strong correlation. We see also here that the number of years of education in many parts of Africa has increased tremendously. Sorry, that is this graph. And we also see that in that sense, if we look at political regimes, that Africa has heavily democratized over the past 30 years. Like in 1985, most African regimes were autocracies, and you see some are like still close to anocracies, but there are also many African countries that are now considered to be full democracies. So you see that like a lot of objective conditions improved, but then also like a key question is on which I today have no answer, unfortunately, but that is like also for an opening up for research, why have Cantrell ladder scores not improved? And one reason for that is that, well, we know, and I'll come back to that later, is that Cantrell ladder is one specific element of well-being and one specific facet of well-being that tends to be very highly correlated also with economic situation. And like, maybe economic growth in Africa has been slow over the past decades. Also saw some figure about that. And if you look also at standard of living, there are still places where there's a prevalence of undernourishment. So there is still some catching up to do, but it's not that there hasn't been a lot of progress made. Also, like, why is potential reasons for Cantrell ladder scores not improving? Also, like an open question for research. A couple of reasons that came up my mind. That slow economic growth, economic circumstances only marginally improving. Also dissatisfaction with like democracy in society, so like places democratized, but like the population is not like always as satisfied with on how democracy works. But also, and that is more like from the behavioral science, it might be that we see periods of growth, but we also see periods of stagnation of the economy, and that like these subjective well-being movements are more sensitive to negative economic growth than to positive economic growth. In addition, like also social comparison may play a role. We have like the globalization thing where maybe African societies over time compared more and more to life in the West, and that's also what Angus Deaton is saying. If we look at like the growth type, and then you see on the left-hand side also in Europe, growth has been very sluggish. Also there, Cantrell ladder scores did not really improve over time. They're more declining in a way than recently than that they are rising. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, growth has been slightly better than in Europe. but still relatively limited compared to other developing parts of the world. And also, if you would ask African citizens, like, what is in their opinion the most important problem facing African countries, what is then what the government should address? That is mostly what you see is that economic factors are mentioned, and these are figures from the Afrobarometer. So, and if you look at the young people, you would see that is the largest share of the population in Africa. And you would see that unemployment, management of the economy, health, but also like infrastructure. My colleague Andrew Clark will tomorrow talk about that, are factors that are considered like most important like problems in African societies, and could also be ways like to increase the contentment in society when more focus in policy is done to address these issues. Then the social comparison. So, like, I think the most famous saying is from Andrew Deaton there. So over time, when globalization took place, is that Africa started to compare them more and more to like Western life. And what Andrew Deaton said about this is that they need to understand how bad life is in Togo, and the Tongolese, through television, understand how good life is in Denmark or in other high-income countries. So social comparison might also explain like why these these Cantwell letter scores did not really increase over time. But so far, like, the bad news, and I especially would like to talk about Africa in a very positive daylight, because I think personally that it might be, of course, the Cantwell ladder and contentment is one aspect of well-being, but there are also like other aspects of well-being that you can measure. I think myself it's a multifaceted concept that remains a little bit like underrepresented in academic research, especially well-being economics have predominantly focused on evaluative measures of happiness, so the Cantwell ladder and life satisfaction, and put aside like other dimensions of well-being. But before that, it's also important to mention that Africa maybe should not be seen, and you of course know that, but like maybe from a Western point of view, we often forget that Africa is a very heterogeneous continent. And if we look at well-being, you see a very divergent pictures of the development of the Cantwell ladder in Africa. And you can also see that change is possible. If you look at this map, then you see that in some countries the Cantwell ladder has increased over the past decades. If you look at a country like Benin, Guinea, Ivory Coast, then you see the green countries in the map have seen a significant improvement in contentment over the period 2009-2023 for most African countries. They are highlighted in green. And you see that in West Africa, you see like a wonderful cluster of countries that have caught up and increased the Cantwell ladder scores. Like in Benin, it like up till the COVID, it goes almost to from a 3.5 to a 6 on average. Also in Guinea, it has been steadily increasing until like 2018. Same for Ivory Coast. In Mozambique, like a little bit like more modest increase. But you see that in like a lot of African countries, the perceived standard of living by means of Cantwell ladder is improving. There are also countries, on the other hand, for various reasons, in which the Cantwell ladder is declining steadily. So if you look at neighboring countries like South Africa, like Eswatini, Lesotho, but also Rwanda and Zambia, you see here that there, over the past like 10, 20 years, there have been a decline in happiness. And like yeah, one of the open research questions is to find better out like why some African countries make progress while others like stay behind or even experience decline in this subjective well-being. But even like within countries, there is like a lot of variation. If you look at, well, you should recognize this as South Africa, you see like higher like levels of contentment in urban areas and suburban areas, much higher than in rural and peri-urban areas. And this like heterogeneity, again, requires attention. But let's move from the Cantrell ladder to other measures of happiness. And let's ask ourselves, are we using the right tools to compare countries, and are we comparing countries in a fair way? And yeah, of course, like these measures of subjective well-being that exist have something in common. And that they have in common that they all examine how individuals perceive and feel about their life and experiences. But they highlight different aspects of these lives and experiences. And it's a multifaceted concept in the end. And the choice of measure that you take can heavily influence the conclusion that you draw about like the quality of people's lives. And like, although the Cantrell ladder is an assessment that has been validated and has been used frequently in well-being research, and it has many advantages because it's a single item measure that is comprehensible for like almost anyone who has asked the question, it is still a very incomplete measure of well-being. And it's also very Western-centric of a measure of well-being, and even a question that in recent research by Nielsen and colleagues showed that you have it's really asking the question also primes like a power and wealth-oriented view of well-being. So it's also no wonder that the Cantrell ladder correlates very high with things like income and status, for example. So that brings us back to also the cross-national comparisons that there are. Cross-national comparisons and overly focused, also by means of the World Happiness Report, on the Cantrell ladder and evaluative measures as outcome measures, and also overly focused on Western conceptualizations of happiness. So we need to redirect maybe some attention to other facets of well-being, and first starting with the heart. So affect, positive emotions that we feel, but also negative emotions that we feel, and the balance between these positive and negative emotions. And well, that is like also to do some promotion for my colleagues. Sometime Talida and Stephanie, they have been building the Gross National Happiness. This website has just launched, and it is like one example like of a very nice new affect measure that measures also well-being in countries. For now, there is the UK, the Netherlands, and South Africa, but undoubtedly many more countries will appear. And there you already see like a surprising view that if you look at their statistics over September, and I don't know whether that's this September, but I assume, then you see that South Africa is not that far from the UK and the Netherlands in terms of affect. On some days, like you see that South Africans were actually happier than the UK and Dutch people. And this data is gathered initially by means of Twitter data, now by means of Google Trends data, and undoubtedly will result in a very nice data set in the coming years. But like, since we don't have like more than 3 countries at the moment, we will resort to Gallup World Poll data to look a little bit deeper into the effect measure. And what does the World Poll data do? I've been discussing like this also with people of the World Happiness Report. It are not the most ideal measures of effect, especially since they're not measured on a scale, but at least there are effect measures in. We have the positive effect that consists of 5 questions. So did you feel well rested yesterday? Yes or no. Were you treated with respect all day yesterday? Yes or no. Did you smile or laugh a lot yesterday? Did you learn or do something interesting yesterday? And did you experience enjoyment yesterday? And if you answer on all these questions yes, you have the maximum positive affect score. Then there's negative affect. That's about more negative emotions. It's also about yesterday, and it's about the experience of physical pain, worry, sadness, stress, and anger. If you answer yes, then you score maximum on this negative affect. And we look at the affect balance here. You can also look at them separately, but we choose for this presentation to have affect balance, where you look at the positive effect minus the negative effect, and that score can range from 5 to -5. Well, if we look at affect balance in the world, we see and also this has been measured for almost all countries in the world, at least on several time points, then you see a very different picture on what is the happiest country. And you see that in some African countries even managed to get in top 15, Somalia, Mauritius, South Africa, Kenya, Senegal. So these countries experience relatively a lot of positive emotions, relatively limited number of negative emotions. You see that Africa is actually at par, South Africa, with a lot of European nations. The score of South Africa is not different than the score from the Netherlands or from the United Kingdom. South America scores generally a little bit higher, and the lower scores you will find mostly in areas of conflict, especially you see there in the Middle East a lot of orange and red. And in that sense, if you compare the Cantor ladder with the subjective, the affect balance score, you see that a lot of African countries score much higher on affect balance than you would expect based on their Cantor ladder score. Also highlighting that these measures probably measure different facets of well-being. And you see that countries like South Africa and Kenya score moderately high on the affect balance, but are not countries that score very high on content. And whereas in the Cantor ladder you would see that 80% of the African countries could be found at the bottom, that is only the case for the affect balance score for 33% of the African nations. And you would then also see what is the African situation. And it has been labeled by Ian Rothman and Ruud Veenhoven as the situation of cheerful discontent. So there are many nations in which African people feel good while being discontented. And then is the question also, what's the most important for happiness, affect or discontent? There's maybe not a definite conclusion, but if you believe the theory of, for example, Zayong, then it would be that the affective experience would dominate the cognitive evaluation. It precedes the cognitive evaluation, and get gratification of needs in that sense would be more important for human flourishing and survival than meeting the learned wants that is more measured by means of contentment, and which also depends much more on social comparison. But as I said, this argument is still very much up to debate. Then you can also question, why Africa has higher affect scores in general than ladder scores. Why does it score much higher on the levels of affect? If you would look at the work of Veenhoven and Mariano Rojas, also studied Latin America in this sense, then you would come at the situation of cheerful discontent, so the situation in which human needs are fairly met, but living conditions fall short to like Western standards, and that like view would dominate the best possible life. And there's also like a situation that we have found, like, or colleagues of mine have found in research in Europe, research on like the unemployed, which is called dissatisfied with life, but having a good day. And that is also related to the fact that in the end, affect balance and control ladder have some overlap, but also are correlated to very different drivers of well-being. And the control ladder is much more correlated with income, healthcare, education, also political functioning, while affect is way more correlated with psychological needs, both the physical psychological needs and the psychological needs, such as autonomy, social relationship, and fulfillment of daily tasks. In that sense, Africa would also score much higher on the fulfillment of psychological needs. We come to some statistics about that later on. And while it scores much lower in terms of gross domestic product, but also education and political function. Another explanation, not like a lot of research, is like the smiling while suffering hypothesis, and that is that positive emotions can also act as a coping mechanism to disadvantaged economic conditions. That brings us also, like, with the effect to some remaining interesting observations that I stumbled across for future research. And that is also like when you correlate the control ladder and the affect balance scores at individual or country level, then you see that like it differs per like continent on how strong that correlation is. So the correlation between the control ladder and the affect balance scores is pretty high in Europe, but also in Middle East and former Soviet Union, but very low in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is both for the country level and individual level correlations. And still the question is like, why is that the case? It might also be that the conceptualizations of one of the two might very differ in Africa, but to be honest, I have no clue, and this is like up for further research. The other interesting observation is that while you see a very varied pattern of control ladder developments within Africa, is that like negative effect has been increasing in sub-Saharan Africa. You see that here, and it has been increasing quite broadly all over the board, so all over the continent, and also that like requires some further investigation. So like some halfway conclusions, it's basically 2/3 of my talk, but halfway was like a nicer term here. We have seen that well-being is a very multifaceted concept, and choice of matter matters. But also, it would also like suggest that if you would take like rankings forward, you should use like more multiple measures of well-being, and that's also very much in the spirit of like the work of Ed Diener, for example, before, who also claimed that it would be better to like have a more multifaceted. What you also like an advantage is of like a more faceted index is that it tends to correlate much better with some of the objective statistics. The Vice President in his opening talk was talking about the Human Development Index, which mainly consists of objective measures like GDP per capita, years of education, and life expectancy. What appears like in a recent article of Blanchflower and Bryson, if you combine the effect in the control ladder measure, you get a much better correlation also with the Human Development Index than when you would only use the control ladder or only the effect measures. So probably in that sense, having a multifaceted measure or index would like give also like a more accurate depiction of what's going on. But is affect and control ladder are the two sufficient? So, of course, if you would take the definition of hedonic well-being, it would consist of a more evaluative measure, and a more like emotional measure related to like predominantly positive and negative emotions. But how we fill that in, like as researchers, and maybe also through like a Western like bias, is that most of the effect measures, not like entirely the ones in the Gallup, but most effect measures focus on high arousal, positive to negative emotions. But like, yeah, the inclusion of specific emotions is very much influenced by the perspective of the researchers. And these researchers, when these measures were developed, were mostly from Western countries. And if you would look, for example, at East Asia, they would prioritize more low arousal positive emotions, such as calmness and feeling at peace. So like, there has been a very nice group of researchers like focusing on like more global measures of well-being, and that focused on how can we expand the measurement of well-being in order to become it more globally inclusive. The paper by Lambert and colleagues reports about like these meetings, but if you would like, they say if you would make it a more global inclusive measure, you would like include also low arousal emotions, so balance and harmony, also more focus on community well-being. So like the current measures are very much focused on the individual, but like in many more collectivistic countries, it will also be that the happiness depends more on the happiness of people close to me. Also the connectedness to nature could be part. Resilience, which is I think very high in Africa, so when life is difficult, people would recall quickly, but also mastery and meaning of life. So capable of dealing with life challenges and daily activities being worthwhile. So if we look, for example, like at optimism or resilience, and you can look at the current ladder score and the future ladder score, so you can ask people on which step of the ladder you are now, on which step of the ladder you think you'll be in 5 years, and you can subtract the two from each other, and you will see that as African countries are very optimistic about like the future. It's like while Europeans and North Americans, maybe also because they're more on the top of the ladder, are much less. But what you see is that in a lot of African countries there's the feeling that the Cantwell ladder can climb up to 3 points in the coming years, so that life can get much better. And like this form of optimism and hope is important, but because without hope there is no like action of people. People need to get activated. People need to see a point of the horizon, but also pathways in order to improve their own lives. And being a little bit hopeful or optimistic about that helps. But it's also that if you look at meaningfulness and also more in focus on community, you could also make the case for eudaimonic well-being. And I have to be very careful because especially my predecessor in Rotterdam, Ruud Veenhoven, doesn't like the concept that much, or doesn't feel that it includes in the well-being measurement. But there is like a case that can be made for it, since what you see, for example, in a lot of African countries, like maybe there's a deficit of meeting basic needs, but working to improve the situation can also help people to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in life. And that would also say that like having more advanced resources can sometimes make up also the happiness of missing basic wants. So that would not primarily follow Maslow, but you can imagine that like working towards a better life can also generate in that sense well-being. And in that sense, the OECD has also suggested to add eudaimonic well-being as a distinct well-being dimension. And eudaimonic well-being is here defined as using and developing the best in oneself. Links to Aristotle's virtue ethics, is also concerned in the end with having optimal skills and qualities that contribute to success in facing the challenges of life. There's a similarity with African concepts like Ubuntu, although I feel that there are also distinct differences in the sense that Ubuntu is way more focused on the community than the eudaimonic well-being definition, but it's about flourishing through moral norms and virtues such as kindness, generosity, compassion, benevolence, and courtesy. Then is the question, can you also measure that? And like using the Gallup World Poll, there has been an index developed by Moshe and Yoshan Lu about optimal human functioning, using some of the Gallup World questions that have been asked. The dimensions that he could identify that were related to eudaimonic well-being is about learning, social support, respect, efficacy. And so can you get ahead in a country by working hard, but also freedom, helping strangers, and volunteering. And if you would look at the eudaimonic well-being across the world, you see that Africa does fairly well. So the top African countries are Liberia, Gambia, Ghana, South Africa also doing well. They are at par with the eudaimonic well-being levels in Europe. They're just a little bit lagging behind the United States and Australia and New Zealand. But you also see that if you would take, again, another facet identified by the OECD as being part of the broader concept of well-being, that Africa doesn't score so low, and that actually I think that the Western world can learn a lot from Africa, and also learning why eudaimonic well-being is so high, maybe also as a way to counteract current developments like increasing burnout and mental problems in Western countries. Then is, of course, the question, is eudaimonic and well-being a condition or an outcome? That has been a little bit of a discussion in the field. I think there's a very nice reconciliation. If you would look at the Veenhoven and at the measures that presented by Yoshan Lu, you can also say it are the skills of a person that determine the life ability of a person, just that mental health does that, or physical health. You can also, some of the skills that fall under eudaimonic well-being, you be trainable, and in that sense the scheme developed by Frank Martela recently in the Personality and Social Psychology review really nicely integrates these different views, so the eudaimonic and hedonic well-being view, and I think even part of capability theory. So it says that these eudaimonic well-being mainly leads to fulfillment also of social needs and agentic needs, and together with the fulfillment of physical needs that would affect affective well-being and evaluative well-being. So what we have seen, I also gave you an overview. It also shows that a lot of research can be done on Africa, and that African is happy in many ways. And they also see that there's a large variation in well-being across the continent, and that also requires a lot of additional research. And this asks also for further investigations where questions can be asked what kind of dimensions are emphasized, what kind of well-being is most important, do we need a further refinement of the concept of well-being in the African context, and are there also, for example, important dimensions lacking in the current measurement of African well-being. Food for thought. It's not something that I can take on alone. I hope that every one of you can contribute to a research agenda like this, and collaborate within the ISQOLS community in the coming years. And I'll stop here, I guess, and take some questions.
very much. My positive effect staying in Africa is now really high. We will take a few questions.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the different strategy of taking the different score between positive and negative affect versus using them as separate kind of indicators.
The strategy was here to, in a limited number of time, present different facets of well-being. Can of course discuss like whether negative, positive effects are like completely different facets or that they are part like of the umbrella emotion. I think it's for both to say they are both related to emotions. On the other hand, they correlate like with different factors, and they can coexist next to each other. For now, I just pure for representation, I pull them together. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. My question is about the tools for measurement. I think you're making an assertion that maybe every culture should develop their own tools for measurement for happiness because of the variation that we've seen through this analysis. But do you suggest that that would be the best way to measure? But how do we compare countries and the different cultures across the world? If your proposition is indeed that every culture or country should have its own measurement. Thank you.
Well, for cross-cultural comparisons, I would not recommend it. It would be very difficult to compare countries. What I'm, however, like a proponent of is expand the current measurement. And I think that, like the committee, I'm using the committee that focused on like a more inclusive measurement like of well-being, so the paper by Lambert and colleagues. I think that there are some elements in that could be taken on board in the more global measurement of well-being. So that would be like some aspects of eudaimonia, eudaimonic well-being, but also more low arousal positive emotions that are in many like indices lacking. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. I really appreciated the presentation and much to learn from it, many fresh ideas. But I still would like to defend the Likert scale or the Kaiser ledger, as you say, because I think it's strange for me how till now all talks seem to be ignoring a big elephant in the room. And this is the inequality. Mm-hmm. Inequality which is very much related to cultural discrimination. So I think the reason why you cannot explain the stagnation and why the Likert scale looks the way that it does is because you do not include a kind of cultural measure which is not only sensitive in terms of the cultural perception of which is true, yeah. And it's a question of whether the measure is enough mapped with the idea of the notion. But there is another aspect that some of the explanatory variables are culturally sensitive. And I think if you put this, even a simpler measure would be able to tell you the picture why things are different in Africa than elsewhere. And it might be quite true that people here are not as happy as elsewhere because of these things. We know also that there are a lot of problems with objective well-being, such as crime and so on, which might also pull people down. Right? So there is an interaction between the objective and subjective well-being on the one side, which can be explored maybe further, and there is a link between these two, which is cultural, and can improve the understanding of how the measures perform, whichever measures we're using. So just a remark, this might be inequalities, cultural discrimination, might be things very relevant per se, and especially for Africa, for using these measures and ideas that you mentioned. So
thank you.
Thank you very much for a really great presentation and the global big picture. I'd like to go more to a practical point of view, and worldwide universities are going through massive changes. So is it possible to use the happiness, contentment, as an idea of how your colleagues feel about what is really happening and how do they feel about decisions, instead of winding up in long, long-winded arguments. Thank you.
I think you can. Yeah. But, yeah.
Thank you very much. I must say that your presentation was very insightful. And as a young African academic, I'm also shifting a little bit away from measurement in terms of quantitative positivism. Will it be out of place to just measure, not measure, but just in terms of qualitative narrative people share within culture, their own realities in terms of happiness? Must we always measure and place figures on it and rank?
Yeah, no, it's like I think that qualitative research can very nicely complement quantitative research here. We also do it within our own organization, so we also have like a research line on qualitative research, talking about like what does happiness mean for people, like in the Dutch context then. But you can also like carry out and cross-national research. There's, for example, a very nice article by Fluck on differences between conceptualization of happiness in South Africa versus happiness in Germany, also showing that like happiness like means slightly different things across the two cultures. Yeah, but yeah, nice suggestion. Also, there's a lot of room for research there.
Do we have any more questions?
I think it's time for cocktails.
It's time. It's wonderful time.
Yeah.